So I'm going to turn it over to the next part with, and Nancy Anderson's going to introduce our next speaker.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Swapna, for that wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. I am here to introduce Claire Stanley. She is a public policy analyst at the National Disability Rights Network. Just a little bit of background. The National Disability Rights Network, or NDRN, is sort of our national arm for the protection and advocacy system, of which ADAP is a part. So before coming to NDRN, Claire was an advocate with the Alabama Council of the Blind, where she advocated for the rights of blind and visually impaired persons, both on a direct level as well as on Capitol Hill. She worked at 2 P&A agencies as a fellow, first with Disability Rights California, and then at Disability Rights DC at University Legal Services in Washington, DC. She received her undergraduate degree in political science and communication from the University of California at Davis, and she received a law degree from the University of California, Irvine in 2015. As a person with a disability, Ms. Stanley believes strongly in the rights of all persons with disabilities. And I'll turn the podium, so to speak, the virtual podium, over to her. Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be with you guys today. I'm, honored to be here and talk to you guys a little bit about the work that we're doing at the National Disability Rights Network and answer any questions that you might have. I know you're going to hear from me as well as 3 of my other colleagues. So we're excited to share with you some of the work that we're doing here at NDRN and the work that we get to do with all of the different protection and advocacy offices, including yours in Alabama. Just a quick correction, I actually did not work for the Alabama Council of the Blind. I worked for the American Council of the Blind, but I did have the privilege to work with the Alabama chapter many times. So thank you so much.
That was a Freudian slip on my part. I guess I just wanted to promote Alabama. Sorry about that.
No problem. We called it the other ACV because they are both ACV.
You're being very gracious. Thank you.
Great. Well, I would love for you guys to ask questions throughout the process. I never like to feel like I'm a talking head. I like interactivity to really make sure that you guys can get your questions answered as I go. So I'm going to do a couple of things today. First, I'm going to talk about a particular bill that we are working on here at NDRN that will impact the lives of Americans with disabilities. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about advocacy and kind of tie that in with how we use advocacy to promote the bill that I'm talking about. And then lastly, I want to leave the remainder for questions. But again, I don't want you guys to feel like you have to hold your questions till the end. So please speak out. I use assistive technology. I'm blind and I use a screen reader, but for accessibility purposes, I've turned it off right now because if I hear a lot of questions screaming out while I'm talking, it can be distracting. So all that to say, if you put questions in the chat box, I won't know they're there. So periodically, I'll just pause and see if there are any questions. And I don't know, is there a good way to have somebody read out the questions as we go? Do you guys have a procedure for that? Hearing none, if you guys have questions, I'll just pause and I'm sorry?
Claire, this is Linda, and I will help monitor the chat.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Great. Okay, so again, I will jump in. So the bill that I was asked to talk about today is the website accessibility website and app accessibility bill. You might have heard it in the past. They used to add the 21st century at the beginning of it, but that's since been dropped. So now we just call it the Web and Application Accessibility Bill. And so as the title implies, we want to make websites and applications accessible for all persons, including those with disabilities. It kind of started out in the blind community because for those of you who aren't familiar, when you use screen reading software, websites can really be inaccessible depending on how the developer designed them from the get-go. However, we made it very clear that this bill is not just for the blind and low vision community. we also want to make sure that websites and applications are accessible for all people. So that might be making sure that if there are videos, there are captions, so it's accessible for persons who are deaf and hard of hearing. It might be making sure that there aren't flashing lights for persons with epilepsy. It might be including plain language for persons with intellectual or developmental disabilities. So we want to make sure that websites are accessible for everybody, because as we know, we live in the 21st century. Everything now is on a website or an app. It's basically our lives. So we want to make sure that those of us with disabilities aren't left behind, so that we can access things like shopping, doctors' offices, government services, things like that. So again, I'll take a step back. This bill started mostly on behalf of the blind community, because a lot of websites aren't accessible with screen reading software. So people would go to websites and suddenly they couldn't access any of the services there. And so they have to be dependent on people without disabilities to go in and perform the tasks for them. And this is wrong for a lot of reasons. One, some people live by themselves, so they don't have that option. Two, if you're an adult, you shouldn't have to ask anybody, right? We're persons with disabilities, we're independent, we should be able to do things on our own. So that shouldn't be how it works. And you also privacy, you know, there's a lot of things that we want to do online where you shouldn't have to feel obligated to tell another individual. You should be able to do it independently and privately by yourself without having to ask anybody for help. So for a whole slew of reasons, we're really pushing for equal access to websites and applications. So a few years ago, the National Federation of the Blind, I believe, was the first org to start writing the language, but it's since been expanded to multiple organizations who are working together. We currently have a coalition that's made up of the National Federation of the Blind, the American Council of the Blind, the American Foundation for the Blind, and that's here at NDRN. And we're actually growing. Now DREDF, the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, has also started working with us. So we're very excited. It's a growing coalition of organizations all advocating for the same thing. So the bill itself talks about a lot of things, but basically its ask is that when entities design a website, they have to take into account accessibility standards. Currently, as it stands, the way the Americans with Disabilities Act is written, we believe, and the Department of Justice has said, that websites do fall under the ADA. But this is the problem. The ADA was passed in 1990, and so it was written in the late 1980s. So websites weren't really around. They weren't really a thing. It's not like we do today where everything's online. And so they weren't really thinking about it. So I am optimistic, and I like to think that if they knew back in 1990 what websites were going to be, they would have been explicit and listed it under the ADA. But because it was a different generation, it was a different time, they didn't say that. And so the Department of Justice has now said on multiple occasions in statements that websites are covered under Titles 2 and Titles 3 of the ADA. So Title 2 being anything that's a public entity, like a county government, and Title 3 being anything that's a private business. And so those are covered under the ADA website-wise, but again, it wasn't explicit in the law because this was pre, the boom of websites. And so because of that, a lot of businesses and lawsuits had argued, no, that's not covered. You'll hear the term brick and mortar bandied about. They say that unless something is a brick and mortar business or entity, it's not covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And again, the Department of Justice has spoken up and said, no, websites are included. But the problem we have in the United States is that when a lawsuit is brought, it goes before a judge, and a judge can make a decision. And we have multiple circuit courts in the United States. And we now currently have what we call a split decision within multiple circuits, where in the Ninth Circuit, for instance, which is out in California, where I'm from, the courts have said it doesn't have to be brick and mortar. A business, even if it's a completely online business like Amazon, it has to be accessible. Whereas some other circuits, more here on the East Coast, they've said, no, brick and mortar is absolutely necessary. If a business wasn't once an actual physical store that you could walk into, then their website doesn't have to be accessible. So we have a little bit of a split, a little bit of a tug of war going on. Now, again, the US Department of Justice has said, no, you have to make your websites accessible. So it's this really frustrating tug of war where we're like, what are we supposed to do? And that is frustrating for us advocates, right? Because we know what DOJ says and we know what the law was supposed to say. But when you have multiple competing theories going on from different courts who are saying different things, it makes it really easy for the businesses out there to say, no, the court's not in your favor, we're not going to do it. And so that is why these organizations, including ours, NDRN, have decided that we think it's time to write a law that says you have to make websites accessible. Now, it's really important. We don't want to say that the ADA has to be amended. I won't go through all of the history, but basically there's been a long history of, if you were ever to, I'll use the word amend the ADA, it can be really dangerous because we don't want to change the law because unfortunately that doesn't have a good track record. So instead we're saying we're not amending the law, we are just emphasizing that the ADA is or that websites are already covered by the ADA. Now we need to put our money where our mouth is and make websites accessible. And so that's what this law is saying. So we're not saying we have to make the ADA say something new. We're saying the ADA already said this. Now let's actually take steps. There's a few different provisions in the website accessibility bill that talk about how to make websites accessible, and they talk about things like usable. And so they're just kind of some term of arts that talk about how you can make a website accessible. There aren't the nitty gritties of how to make the website accessible. That would eventually come through the process of regulatory or developing regulations that would help decide what makes a website accessible. And another thing we've talked about is we want to be really careful that we don't say exactly what would make a website accessible, because as we all know, kind of like I talked about earlier, websites weren't even a thing when the ADA was written. So we're really nervous to say that to be accessible, you have to be exactly this, because I bet we'd all be willing to bet money that in 20 years, technology is going to look totally different, right? It's something that changes so quickly. So the way we're writing the legislation is to say that it's going to keep changing. There's always, I call them toys. There's always a new toy out there. Websites change, apps change, technology is just constantly changing. So we want to make sure that the law keeps up with what technology looks like. And we want to make sure that that is accessible. So that's kind of the bill in a nutshell. Next, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the steps we're taking to advocate for change. But before I do that, are there any questions about the bill itself?
I do have a question.
Yep.
What is the brick and mortar?
Yeah, that is a great question. So when we use the term brick and mortar, and it's kind of a legal term of art, it basically means a physical store that you can walk into. So let's say Target, right? I bet most of us have been to a Target store in our life. That's a physical store that you can go into and go shopping for clothes and food and toiletries. So in the situation I was talking about, they were saying that the business, if the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to it, it has to be brick and mortar. It has to be a Target that you can physically go into and buy products from. Whereas in our argument, we're saying there are a lot of businesses that aren't physical stores with walls and bricks and drywall. They can just be online, right? Because we live in 2022 where lots of businesses are solely online. So it's just the difference between a physical building that we walk into every day versus something that's just online.
I see it right now.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Yes. This is Allison McNeil. I'm asking this question as, can you hear me?
I can. It's a little hard, but I can hear you right now. Yep.
Okay, hold on just a second. I think maybe. Okay.
I can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Okay, this is a question coming as someone who has designed websites in the past and specifically designed like medical websites. So I had to follow the AMA and the American Medical Association. Do y'all have as a part of your team and help writing this bill, people in that sector?
Do we have people in the medical sector?
No. Have you, I guess, let me rephrase. Have you met with and talked to and got advice from web designers and programmers and so forth that would be designing and end up being the ones who would need to change these websites due to this law?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are a couple things I want to answer to that. So one, we're trying not to be too specific on writing what I often call the nitty gritty, which are like the very specific details. Those that have already kind of been developed by some outside entities. There's one thing called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. You might hear people call it WCAG for short. So those are kind of the outside entities that we point people to say, if you want a good standard, this is what you need to follow. Although that has not, and I repeat, has not been adopted by the US government. So it's just a good resource right now. It's not legally binding, but those are the kinds of things we point people to. So the law itself is not going to say in great nitty gritty detail what needs to go. It's a little bit more of a 10,000 foot view saying this is, you just need to make your websites accessible. Then if regulations are promulgated, which is kind of a second step to it, that would be regulated. And that's where more of the specifications would come in. And that's of course where they take into account the advice from the computer programmers and the engineers and the designers, because I always joke, I'm somebody with a disability who knows how to use a computer, but I have no idea how to program one. So it's a big difference in expertise. So yes, once they get to the regulatory process, that's where they take into consideration all of those kinds of elements.
Okay, yeah, that's what, as someone looking at it, like as the whole big, huge picture, as someone who has designed and developed websites, I can see that being super important for to have people actually be compliant with the bill. And then secondly, I think that there's going to be a big call and need for some kind of funding, because it's going to be difficult for, I mean, well, I can say this with a lot of certainty that, I mean, the federal government's going to have to change a lot of their own websites to be in compliance, number one, and first off, but then secondly, like your small businesses or your nonprofits and your small brick and mortars and stuff like that, that's going to be a big ask for those businesses if it's not solely adopted also by, you know, your search engines and so forth. There would need to be a big, huge adoption across the board.
Yeah. And one distinction to make there that you just pointed out as far as federal entities go. So if we're talking about federal agencies, they actually already are supposed to be compliant, because that falls under Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which starts to get really confusing and makes your head spin. But basically, if something's funded federally and is a federal agency, they have to be web compliant, because the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the law that I'm mostly referencing, that only applies to state or local governments. The Rehab Act applies to federal entities that receive federal funding. And so they have to be compliant under what we call 508, which is a pretty similar standard. And as we talk about what should make something accessible in our research and our advocacy, we do often point to 508 and say, well, that's a good standard you can meet. So that's actually an important thing to know, is that that technically already is applicable. And so they are two different situations going on.
Okay, it would be I would be interested in at some point reading the technical terms of the bill. Just and as a part of my project here with PIPA, I would be very interested in that. So as I go forward with the design, that I can keep that in mind. because, that can change and pivot everything. So.
Yeah, and when we do this advocacy, we often encourage people to reach out to some of the major accessibility companies. Unfortunately, they do cost money if you were to employ them to make your website accessible. But if you just want to check out their website for resources, those are great places to start because they are experts in making websites accessible. So for instance, one of the major ones out there is Level Access. I often tell people to check out Level Access's services. So there are orgs already that have like the expertise on making websites accessible.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for all your questions. Those are great questions.
This is Jenny Lux. I had one question really specific.
Yep.
Are there any governing organizations or membership organizations for web developers that specifically do ADA compliance? Because I had a friend of mine who almost got scammed by an illegitimate company.
Ooh, that is scary. No, there's no such thing right now. So yeah, if you get a call saying, we are the government that's assessing your website, that does not exist.
Okay.
The only thing that kind of falls into that category, again, is if you are a federally funded entity like the federal government and you have to comply with the 508 standards. The 508 Department of, for instance, I have a friend who's the 508 coordinator for the Department of Veterans Affairs for the VA. He can call up anybody in the VA and say, it's my authority to look over your websites or your programs. But that's very specific to the Rehab Act. So yeah, otherwise, no, if you get that call, no.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? And if questions come up on what I was just talking about, feel free to sprinkle them in as we go. Okay, so the next part I wanted to talk to you about is kind of what we've been doing at NDRN to promote these bills. And it's not just us, it's also our allies in the coalition. So when we talk about advocacy, I think the important thing to remember is that no one size fits all. And when you're advocating, oftentimes just starting or just applying one form of advocacy and sticking with that, that's often not the best way to go. I've really learned in my years of advocacy that you kind of take from here and take from there, and you apply a lot of different forms of advocacy. I often joke it's almost like, throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. And that's something that our coalition is doing as it pertains to the Website and App Accessibility Act. So we've started as a piece of legislation, right? And that was kind of the byproduct of years and years and years of asking for them to promulgate regs. So back during the Obama administration, the Department of Justice, who has the authority to promulgate regulations. And when I say promulgate regulations, I basically am saying the Department of Justice has the responsibility to create those specific rules to say how you make a website accessible. And they have the authority in all kinds of situations to create those rules or regulations, as we call them. So under the Obama administration, so that was over 10 years ago now, they had promised, don't you worry, we're going to promulgate these regs, or again, create these rules. And the disability community was really excited. We thought, great, we're going to have these regulations. And when we have these, it's going to clarify to people who create websites how to make their websites accessible. And then hopefully when you have these regulations which clarify things, people are going to hop to and do it. Well, for many different reasons, a whole slew of reasons, the Obama administration never got very far. They did, and I'm going to use a lot of government terms, and I will try to clarify what they mean, but feel free to ask questions. So they did what we call an ANPRM, an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And that's just kind of the beginning of this process where you start to allow the public to weigh in and give their comments on how to make things accessible in this situation. So they did an ANPRM. And so we were like, this is awesome. They're starting to really explore the idea of creating these regulations. And then time passed and more time passed and more time passed and nothing happened. And so people were really frustrated because they thought President Obama, his administration, is going to be the one to create these rules. but it never happened. And his 8 years ended and nothing ever happened. And then during the Trump administration, people were kind of nervous to bring this up again because they were scared about what the result might be. So all that to say, they never came up then. So now we're here years later during the Biden administration, and Biden said, you know, don't worry, I'm going to work on this. So we're excited about that. But all that to say, it took well over 10 years and nothing happened. So instead of depending on what we call the regulatory process, which is what I just talked about, using the executive branch of the government, so all of the leaders who serve under the authority of the president, we looked to the other side and said, well, if the administration isn't going to do anything, meaning the president and his employees, we're going to go to Congress. We're going to go to the legislative branch and create a new law. So that's kind of an example of how in advocacy, you might start under one branch of the government, but if nothing's happening, sometimes you change course, you change your mind and you do a different way. And that's when our coalition said, we're just going to create a law because the executive branch doesn't do anything, so we're going to the legislative branch. And so that's when this law started developing a few years ago. And it's grown, it's evolved, it's changed. We edit it as we go. But that's where this law has come from. So that's why we started in one form of advocacy through the regulatory process under the administration, and now we've changed to the legislative process. So that's where we are right now. We've been working with some offices in Congress to get it introduced. The main office we're talking with to introduce the bill, because in order to get a bill introduced in Congress, you have to find a Congress member, either a representative or a senator, and eventually you need it in both houses of the government, of the legislature. But the office we've been talking with most closely is on the Senate side, and that's Senator Duckworth from Illinois. So we've been talking with her office very closely about introducing this bill. They haven't done it yet, but we've had lots and lots and lots of conversations with them, and they've looked at the drafts of this bill and have edited it and edited it and edited it some more. So that's where we are right now. So that's how we went from one group to the next. Well, now there's the new Biden administration. And so we have a new president. And so now they're starting to say, hey, you know, this is a new president in power. Maybe we'll go back to the original process and we'll do it through the executive branch instead of the legislative branch. So we said, and we being the coalition said, okay, that's great. President Biden wants to work with us. We'll work with you, but we're still a little nervous because of this history. So we'll work with you administratively, but we're not going to let go of the legislative process because we think we should keep both hands in those pots to see which one will work. And so we're now doing both. So our coalition wrote a letter a couple months ago now. Time goes by fast. A couple months ago, we wrote a letter to the Assistant Attorney General and said, hey, we see what's going on under Biden. Could you help promulgate these regulations? So we did that. We also wrote a letter to several senators, including Duckworth, who's helping to do that, to say, hey, can you use your power as senators to push, to urge, to encourage the Department of Justice to promulgate these regulations. But again, we're still working on the legislation because we don't want to let that go. So that is an example of how when you're pushing for advocacy, you want to have your hands in multiple pots. You don't want to just necessarily do it one way. If you start with one way and it's working and you're making progress, then keep going. But if you try one way and it's not working, maybe you go a different way, but maybe you can go back to the first way. And so I think this is a perfect example of how when you're advocating something, get creative, use multiple approaches, and don't feel like, you have to stick with one or the other. I think that's a perfect example of how when Biden came back to us, his administration came back to us and said, I'll work with you. We said, great, but we're not stopping the legislation because we don't want to get too excited, right? And then think his administration is going to do something. And then I don't like to be pessimistic, but if something at the end of the day doesn't happen, then we lose all that work we did with creating the bill. So we're not going to lose all that work we did. We're going to continue to push on one side. We're going to push on the other side. So that's kind of an example of how you advocate for things and you use multiple approaches. So do you guys have any questions about that? Nope. Okay.
I do have a question.
Yep.
What are a primary example of APRM? Like, why you try to say like APRM? And how does the process work?
Yeah. An advance notice of proposed rulemaking. It's a really good question. So notices of proposed rulemaking are just a process in which the government thinks they're going to make a decision. They want to create new regulations or rules. In other words, they want to make a decision that could impact all Americans. And so what they do is they write out several questions or ideas of things they want to do, and they publish them in what we call the Federal Register. The Federal Register is public to everybody. You can literally Google Federal Register and it'll pop up, and they put all these comments, all these ideas, all these things they want to do. And every single American has the right to go to the Federal Register, read those ideas, and submit their own comments. And so that's what was going on. They said, we're thinking about making these rules. What do you as Americans think? And any American could go online, print that out, read what it says, and go online and submit their own comments. You don't even have to do it online. You can also fax it in, you can send it in over the mail. Every American has the right to add their comments. And so that's what that was. It was a process to allow people to go in and start submitting their thoughts about this. So that's why we're really excited. We're like, great, they want our input. They want to know what people are thinking. And then, like I said, unfortunately, nothing ever came of it. But I'd encourage you guys, if you're ever interested, just go to the Federal Register and you can do searches for different topics you're interested in. And you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to be a lawyer. Everybody has the right to comment on things that are in the Federal Register. That's a great question.
Yeah, okay.
Mhm. Any other questions?
No, I haven't.
Thanks. Cool. So, and again, feel free to chime in with any other questions. So that's kind of where we are right now with the website and app accessibility bill. We continue to talk with Senator Duckworth's office. One thing that her office also really wants is the support of other disability advocacy groups. So we're trying to build up what we call our coalition. That's a really important thing when you're advocating. The more organizations and people you have supporting an issue, the louder you are, right? Two voices are louder than one, 3 voices are louder than 2, and so on and so forth. So what we've been doing is reaching out to many of the other disability rights organizations, because there's a lot of them in the United States, which is really exciting. A lot of the organizations advocate for one type of a disability. Some, like NDRN, we advocate for the whole community of people with disabilities. We've been trying to get them to sign on to our letters. For instance, that letter we wrote to the Associate Attorney General, we had something like I think it was 180 different organizations signed on to that letter to show their support for what we were asking for. So that was a big thing we were doing, is coalition building when we advocate for these issues. Because don't get me wrong, if even one person is advocating for an issue, that's awesome. Go out and do it. But if you can get another voice to add to yours, then it's just a little bit louder. And so that's what's really cool about coalition building. You might not be doing the exact same thing at any one given time, but if you can support each other and advocate for the same types of things, it brings a little bit more sound to it. It makes it a little bit louder. And so that's something we've also been doing. Like I said, we started as about 4 groups. Now we've brought in a couple extra groups, and we're hoping to just grow and grow and grow as we go, so that we can really let both Congress and the Department of Justice know that this is an issue that a lot of people, not just one person or organization, cares about. So that's a great example of coalition building when you're advocating for an issue. Yeah, I think those are the main things I wanted to talk about. One other thing that we do as advocates that's really important is to continue to use the media and social media. For instance, about a month ago, the Department of Justice did do something that was kind of a baby step in this issue. They put out guidelines on making websites accessible. And so let me give you a background on this for those of you who aren't familiar. The words they use really matter. So there's a difference between guidelines and regulations. Guidelines are not legally binding, regulations are. So if regulations tell you you have to do something, then if you don't do them, somebody could take you to court and say, the regulations say to do this, you didn't do it, and now you're legally in trouble or you're legally liable. Guidelines are more of a really helpful suggestion, and they're really good. It's great when the government writes them. You can find them on the websites, and they can be a really good guidepost to help you know what you're supposed to do. So the Department of Justice just put out guidelines for website accessibility about a month ago. So people were like, oh, aren't you excited? That's great. They did what you were asking. And we said, we're happy. That's great. They're thinking about it, but that's not the end all be all. That's not the last thing we want them to do, because again, they're only guidelines. They're not legally binding. And until something's legally binding, unfortunately, not everybody does it. We want people to do it, right? But I'm a realistic person. Sometimes people don't do it unless they're legally required to do it. And so all that to say, going back to the idea of the media and social media, we got a call from a reporter and he said, aren't you excited? You know, the Department of Justice just came out with these guidelines on website accessibility. And I think this reporter thought like, you know, this is the best thing ever. And, you know, we had to politely say, well, actually, these are just guidelines. You know, we're excited that they're taking steps to make websites accessible, but we don't know what's really going to happen until we see how people respond to this, because they only are just guidelines. So another really important venue you can use to advocate for things is through social media, through the media itself. We like to talk to reporters when things are going on to talk about issues. We like to use Twitter and put things up to kind of bring awareness. Again, coalitions are great and more voices are better than one. So when we tweet something, we love when someone retweets it and really gets that stuff out there. So just not being afraid to put something out on Facebook or Twitter, TikTok, whatever you might use, and just letting people hear about the issues that people are experiencing so that we can get more awareness out there about what we're doing and the issues that we're advocating for. Do you guys have any questions about that? Well, I think that was the main things I wanted to cover about the bill. So are there any other questions about website accessibility in general, about advocacy in general for persons with disabilities, or advocacy period? Kind of how you can use different tools and different venues. You know, I always think it's important to remember that in the United States, we have a 3-tiered system of our government: the judicial branch, the administrative branch, and the congressional branch. So it's important to remember that things can be done in 3 different ways, and even more than that, and really understanding how you should experiment in all 3 of them and see what works. And again, you can start in one place and go back to another place and jump around. I think that's something I've learned in my advocacy life, is that there is no one clean cut way to do things, that it's a little bit of trial and error in all different respects. And just, again, the spaghetti that you throw at the wall and see what sticks.
Well, thank you, Clary. That's been very helpful, a lot of information.
Mm-hmm.
We really appreciate you joining us today. I did send them the papers that you referenced to, so they do have all of that to look at going forward. And if we do have, this will allow us a few minutes to take a break. When I sent out the agenda, I scheduled no breaks for the whole afternoon. So that would be great. We'll be able to take a 15-minute break and be back here at 3 p.m. Central Time.
Hey,
I think
Linda,
you have a colleague joining us. Oh,
Yes.
there's Eric on the line.
let me just, sorry, I'm a little late for this. I'll talk a little bit later on, but Claire, I wanted to know, because I jumped in late, had you talked a little bit also about sort of the concerns about opening up the ADA?
I did. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure of that. And
Yep.
then I don't want to hold the breakup, but let me reiterate what Claire said. This is not public policy is not a sprint. It is a long process. Like the story I use is I started working on a bill and it took 8 years before we got it through Congress. So it's a long haul and you need to be ready for that long haul.
I'd just like to mention, we do have someone that's in this group that on a state level has introduced a bill, and through this partners program at the very beginning in November, we had a legislator join us and he introduced it right before they broke this year. So it was very exciting to see that go through. And yes, it was introduced, didn't have time to go very far, but we can see the process and how it's going to work for next year going forward. So
That's great.
exciting.
Okay. Sorry to jump in and be a little late.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Thank you so much. And if you guys have any questions, follow up about the bill or just anything I said, I'm sure our contact information can get to you guys. So feel free to reach out with questions.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.
So Linda,
Yes,
come
ma'am.
back at 3 or
Yes.
4 my time, 3 your time.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.